10 years ago, the protagonist's mentor and lover, who was a witch, was stripped of her clothes and publicly humiliated by humans. After completely trampling on her dignity as a witch, they shot her to death. But even that didn't satisfy them. They ended the grotesque act only after beheading her corpse and displaying it as a warning. As for the protagonist being her disciple, he was permanently imprisoned. 10 years later, due to an unexpected turn of events, he gained his freedom. The first thing he decided to do was to annihilate humanity. Interestingly, in ancient times, the relationship between humans and witches was harmonious. After creating humanity, God gave a portion of divine power to the witches to guide and protect humans. However, as humans developed technology, they invented weapons specifically to target witches, with the goal of eradicating them entirely. The real reason for this was humanity's growing reluctance to rely on witches and, more importantly, their loss of reverence and respect. During this massacre, the protagonist's mentor was the last surviving witch. To stay alive, they had to flee across the desert to seek refuge in another land. Along the way, the protagonist couldn't help but complain, suggesting that instead of living this fugitive life, they should use magic to destroy the country by hunting them. However, his mentor, devoted to her mission, refused to kill humans proactively. Her only hope was to find a nation that would accept witches. But while they were consulting a map in the desert, the military tasked with hunting witches found them. As a high-ranking witch capable of controlling ice magic, the mentor easily defeated the soldiers with a simple spell. Yet neither the protagonist nor his mentor noticed that the soldiers carried tracking devices. In the next moment, they were suddenly launched into the air. Only then did the witch realize that humans had mastered long-distance teleportation techniques. Using satellites, the humans teleported their targets to a specific location. This was an advanced technique that even the witch's magic couldn't completely counter. Soon, the protagonist and his mentor were teleported to the Empire's central square. Upon seeing the king on the platform, the protagonist immediately rushed forward, intending to buy time for his mentor. But his actions were naive. Within moments, the guards apprehended him. This infuriated his mentor, who threatened the king to release the protagonist or face her absolute zero magic, which could kill everyone in the country. However, what the mentor didn't expect was that her magic suddenly disappeared halfway through its activation. The king on the platform smirked at this sight, revealing that they had already developed a magic nullification device. The king then approached the protagonist's mentor while the crowd noticed that the upper half of the witch's body was exposed, and they began taking pictures with their phones. Seeing this, the protagonist couldn't hold back his rage. Breaking free from the soldiers, he charged at the king, but he was still too weak. After a few steps, he was pinned to the ground again. This act enraged the king, who immediately ordered the protagonist to be executed. Seeing the mentor give up and plead for him, the protagonist, desperate, began scribbling forbidden magic incantations on the ground. But at that moment, the king suddenly pulled out a handgun and aimed it directly at the mentor's head. After mercilessly riddling her body with bullets, the king's bloodlust remained unsated. He ordered his men to decapitate her corpse and then held her severed head high to display it to the gathered crowd. Perhaps moved by the mentor's pleas, the king decided to spare the protagonist's life. Instead, he was imprisoned. 10 years later, in the Empire's prisoner camp, two captives began fighting over a small piece of bread. Neither of them would yield until a pink-haired girl named Doroka selflessly offered her own bread to resolve the dispute. However, her kindness was met with ingratitude, and she was scolded for interfering. Seeing this, Doroka's companion, Anna, grew increasingly concerned about her health. Despite Doroka's efforts to appear cheerful and strong, Anna harbored little hope for their future. No matter how advanced humanity's technology had become, the brutal oppression in the camp seemed endless. Humanity continued its endless cycle of conflict. They had once claimed that eliminating witches would bring them happiness, but why had it led to this state of despair? While Anna was overwhelmed with dismay, Doroka playfully pulled out her hands. She began mimicking a knight and princess's dialogue to cheer Anna up. However, amidst their attempt to find solace, a guard suddenly ordered prisoner number 218 to step forward. None of the prisoners taken away like this had ever returned. As fear gripped Anna, she slowly lowered her head, and on her identification tag, the number 218 was clearly displayed. At that moment, Doroka stepped forward to take Anna's place. She was soon brought before the warden. To her shock, the warden immediately demanded that she strip off her clothes. When Doroka refused, the warden grew furious. Before offering prisoners like her to the Empire's elites, they needed to conduct a thorough inspection. The warden emphasized that everything here was funded by the hard-earned money of Imperial citizens, and prisoners like Doroka had no choice but to obey. Otherwise, they'd end up like the broken girls on the sofa nearby. Seeing the fear in Doroka's eyes, the warden was delighted, relishing such expressions the most. She was confident Doroka would fetch a high price. However, just as the warden was about to send photos of Doroka to potential buyers, something unexpected happened. Doroka seized the moment and bit the warden hard. While the sadistic woman screamed in pain, Doroka snatched her phone and bolted out of the room. During her escape, she initially tried to open all the prison cells. However, she soon realized the phone required voice recognition to operate. After countless failed attempts, she finally discovered the correct command. In an instant, every cell door in the prison swung open. The ensuing chaos among the prisoners caused the guards to lose track of Doroka. While the guards desperately radioed for backup, Doroka, in her panic, ended up in front of a massive sealed door. With her command, the door, locked and untouched for over a decade, slowly opened. At last she was free, ready to unleash her vengeance on humanity. As she stared at a terrified guard, frozen in fear, she didn't hesitate and lunged at him. In the struggle, she snatched his baton and pinned him to the ground with unrelenting force. Yet, this was only the beginning. Over the past 10 years, the protagonist had imagined this very moment countless times in his mind. The guards, unable to respond to her calm and calculated attacks, fell one by one, lying helplessly on the ground awaiting their demise. Meanwhile, the girl who had assisted the protagonist in escaping suddenly caught his attention. Ignoring her frightened expression, the protagonist slowly raised his gun and pointed it at her head. With a loud gunshot, the girl collapsed to the ground in terror, but to her surprise, her handcuffs were released. After freeing her, the protagonist, expressionless, turned and walked away from the scene. He first retrieved his magical brush, then ascended to the tallest point in the city. It was from here that he intended to begin his vengeance against humanity. At the same time, the National Security Bureau, having learned of the incident, dispatched their most capable officer to handle the situation. However, the blonde officer's first act upon arriving was to mercilessly execute all the useless prisoners in the facility. Elsewhere, although the protagonist's gunshot had already made headlines, it failed to bring him any sense of satisfaction. He couldn't help but think that if his mentor were alive to see this, she would have surely scolded him. Yet, even after 10 long years, the memory of his mentor's final gaze and voice lingered vividly in his mind, as if it had happened just yesterday. He vowed to make humanity pay in blood for their sins. The next moment, a giant hand suddenly emerged from the street, revealing a massive golem summoned by the protagonist's magic. As the golem stood tall, it swung its massive fist, demolishing a nearby apartment building. The protagonist stood silently, watching as the terrified humans below scattered in chaos. In no time, under the protagonist's relentless destruction, the once peaceful city turned into a playground of devastation. But this wasn't enough. His ultimate target was the Emperor, the man who had killed his mentor with his own hands. At this point, the government deployed tanks to combat the colossal golem. However, no matter how precisely they aimed, the tank shells failed to fly in straight lines, veering wildly off course. Ironically, the misfired shells caused significant casualties among their own people. Witnessing this, the protagonist couldn't contain his excitement. He then commanded the golem to hurl building debris, destroying all the tanks in its path. Though the protagonist had spent nearly a decade without direct conflict, this also meant he had endless time to perfect the art of tormenting humanity. Just as he descended further into madness, the blonde officer from a distance used binoculars to confirm his location. Moments later, a barrage of fighter jets launched missiles at the golem. The sudden missile attack caused the protagonist to lose his balance and fall to the ground. He lamented how his body had indeed become sluggish over the years. However, he sneered. Mere humans could never be a match for him. In no time, through his reckless counterattacks, all the soldiers were eliminated, leaving only one officer alive. Just as the protagonist was about to deliver the final blow, Doroka arrived on the scene and stopped him. Doroka begged the protagonist to stop, pleading that enough lives had already been lost in this nation. But her request didn't soften his resolve. Instead, it only fueled his fury. Hearing her mention his mentor's name pushed him into an uncontrollable rage. In his eyes, Doroka was nothing more than a pawn sent by humans to manipulate him. Humans were always scheming with their underhanded tricks. If it had been an honorable fight, his mentor would never have been killed. Seeing the protagonist lose himself in madness, Doroka revealed that she, too, was a witch. However, this revelation only infuriated him further. Witches had been exterminated a decade ago. Even if she were telling the truth, why hadn't they come to save his mentor back then? To this, Doroka explained that they had been fleeing for their own lives and were powerless to intervene. But now, there was still a way. They could bring his mentor back to life. The protagonist, however, dismissed her words as an insult to his mentor. How could someone who was dead possibly be resurrected? Enraged, he raised his sword, ready to kill the woman standing before him, spouting what he believed to be lies. Yet Doroka did not resist. Instead, she smiled and said it had been a blessing to meet him. At that moment, the protagonist saw a glimmer of his mentor in her expression. His emotions overwhelmed him, and he finally broke down.